The baby came screaming into the world with skin already marked, as if something had reached up from the dark before breath ever touched its lungs. Blood slicked the floorboards. The midwife's hands trembled, nails thick and yellowed, curved like talons that had forgotten their purpose. Outside the cabin, the wind pushed through the blue ridge trees with the sound of distant crying, and somewhere down the hollow, a dog howled as if it knew what had just been born. No one noticed the faint green stain left behind where those nails pressed into newborn flesh. No one wanted to see it. In these mountains, you learned early which truths were survivable and which ones would rot you from the inside. They would later say the screaming never really stopped, that even after the child quieted, after the cord was cut and the body wrapped and handed to its mother, something in the air kept wailing. Wood beams remembered it. Dirt remembered it. The hills themselves carried the sound, passing it ridge to ridge like a warning that came too late. There are places where birth is not a beginning but a continuation, where bloodlines do not branch outward but curl inward, folding over themselves until generations become indistinguishable. The Blue Ridge Hollows were such places, names repeated, faces repeated, mistakes repeated, and when something finally went wrong enough to be noticed, it was already too old to stop. If you're listening to this now, pause just long enough to ask yourself something simple. Which city are you listening from, and what time is it right now? The answer matters more than you think. These stories don't stay where they're born. The mountains in western North Carolina had always resisted intrusion. Old survey maps showed blank spaces where towns should have been, ink fading into nothing, as if the cartographers themselves had decided some places were better left unnamed. Roads arrived late and poorly. Doctors later still what filled the gaps instead were midwives, preachers, and families who learned to survive without witnesses. Raven's Peak rose above one such hollow, a shoulder of rock and trees where cabins clung like scabs that refused to heal. In 1953, fewer than 50 people lived there. Most shared the same last name. Fewer still could trace their ancestry outside the valley without running into themselves. Marriage records doubled back. Birth ledgers contradicted each other. The past was not buried, it was stacked, layered, and still breathing. At the center of it all lived a woman whose hands had welcomed more lives into the world than anyone could count. She had learned her trade from blood, passed down like an heirloom that carried both skill and contamination. By the time whispers began, it was already too late. Patterns had formed, graves had filled, and something ancient, fed by isolation and repetition, had begun to surface through skin and bone. The child born screaming would not be the first, it would not be the last, and the woman who caught it did not yet understand that her touch had become a kind of inheritance, one that could not be washed away. The hollow had no official name on state records, only a penciled note on a church registry that read Raven's Hollow, as if even the clerk had been uncertain whether it truly existed. It lay cupped between two ridges where sunlight arrived late and left early, filtered through hemlock and pine thick enough to dim noon into something like dusk. Snow lingered here longer than it should. So did memory. People born in the hollow often died in it, and those who left carried the place inside them like a persistent ache. The families who settled there had come in waves, first after the Civil War, then again when coal seams promised work but delivered only hunger. Land was scarce, trust was scarcer. Marrying outside the hollow meant inviting strangers into secrets that had survived precisely because they were never spoken aloud. So cousins married cousins, widowers married nieces, bloodlines braided tighter with every generation until ancestry stopped being a story and became a closed circuit. Church records from the late 19th century show the same surnames appearing again and again, sometimes listed as witnesses to their own ceremonies. A man baptized on one page reappears 2 pages later as a father, and then again as an uncle, and then again as a grandfather, without the years between ever making sense. The margins are crowded with corrections, scratched out dates, and careful euphemisms, close kin, distant relation, words meant to soften truths that could not be undone. By the time the midwife was born, the hollow had already learned how to look away. She arrived into the world on a winter night, delivered by her own grandmother, who was also her great-aunt, hands steady despite the cold. The child was small but alive, her cry thin and sharp like a blade testing air. Her fingers curled inward even then, nails pale and oddly thick, as if the body had already begun compensating for something missing or something wrong. She grew up surrounded by women who taught her how to read weather in bone pain, how to recognize illness by smell alone, how to coax life out of a body that had decided it did not want to stay. Men came and went, some to the mines, some to graves, but births were constant. Babies arrived whether the world was ready for them or not, and the midwife watched, learned, absorbed. By 19, she was catching infants herself, standing where her grandmother once stood, repeating the same motions with only minor variations. Her reputation grew quietly. No advertisements, no announcements, just word carried along creek beds and fence lines. When labor began, someone went for her. She always came. At first, deaths were accepted as part of the mountain bargain. Infants were fragile, mothers bled, God decided. But ledgers from the early 1950s show a shift, a cluster of short lives, similar symptoms, similar timing, all born under the same hands. No one said it out loud yet. The hollow preferred its horrors unspoken, but patterns, once formed, do not need permission to exist. And beneath the midwife's nails, something waited, patient as rot, growing quietly with every generation that had taught itself survival at the cost of truth. The child who would force the hollow to notice what it had been avoiding was born just as the leaves began to turn, when the mountains smelled of damp earth and decay. Labor lasted too long. The mother screamed until her voice broke into something animal, something stripped of language. When the child finally emerged, he did not cry at first. He stared, eyes open, unfocused, fixed on nothing and everything at once, as if he were listening to something the room could not hear. They named him Thomas, a name already worn thin by use. There had been other Thomases, too many to count. The name carried weight, expectation, a sense of inevitability. From the beginning, he was wrong in small, unsettling ways. His skin held a grey cast, like ash rubbed into flesh. He fed poorly but did not weaken. He lay awake for hours, silent, watching the shadows crawl across the ceiling as if tracking their movement. The midwife visited often, more often than was strictly necessary. She told herself it was caution, experience, but she felt something tightening in her chest every time she crossed the threshold of that cabin. When she touched the child, even through cloth, she felt heat, too much heat. Her nails left faint impressions on his skin that lingered longer than they should have, pale marks that slowly reddened, then darkened, like bruises remembering a blow. As weeks passed, neighbors began to comment on how little Thomas cried, how still he was. Babies were supposed to wail, to demand, to announce themselves. This one watched. When he did make sound, it was not hunger or pain, but a thin keening that rose suddenly in the night and stopped just as abruptly, leaving the house ringing with absence. Animals avoided the cabin. Chickens refused to roost nearby. A goat broke its tether and ran, snapping the rope like it had been cut. The mother noticed dead birds in the yard, small bodies unmarked, eyes clouded over as if something had passed through them and moved on. She buried them without telling anyone, already learning the old lesson of the hollow. Some things were safer kept close. By the third week, the rash appeared. It always did. Red at first, then blistering, then weeping. The skin broke down as if it no longer recognized itself as a boundary. The midwife knew the pattern now. She had seen it too many times to pretend otherwise. But knowing did not grant her the power to stop it. She applied poultices, whispered reassurances, avoided direct contact when she could, though the damage had already been done at the moment of birth. As the child weakened, his gaze sharpened. When the midwife leaned close, he fixed on her hands, eyes tracking every movement of her fingers. There was no accusation there, no fear, only recognition, as if some part of him understood the transaction that had taken place, the inheritance he had received without consent. The hollow began to murmur, quietly at first, then with purpose. They had tolerated many things, but patterns demanded acknowledgement, and the child, fading under familiar symptoms, was becoming impossible to explain away. The nights grew louder as the child declined, not with crying alone, but with sounds that did not belong to any single throat. A low vibration settled into the cabin after sunset, humming through the floorboards, rattle-ing the glass jars on the shelves. Those who lived closest said it felt like standing too near a generator, a pressure that filled the skull and made sleep impossible. Mothers woke with milk leaking from their breasts, though their own children were long grown. Old men dreamed of hands clawing out of earth that refused to stay packed down. Inside the cabin, the mother stopped lighting lamps after dark. She said the shadows moved when the flame was lit, sliding along the walls in shapes that did not match the furniture casting them. The child's eyes followed those movements too, head turning slightly, neck too strong for a body so small. When he screamed now, it was with a sound that scraped the nerves raw, a high, thin wail that seemed to peel outward rather than rise, as if it were being pulled from him by something just beyond reach. The midwife began wearing cloth wrappings around her hands, layers of cotton soaked in boiled water and alcohol. It changed nothing. Wherever her nails passed close, the child's skin reacted, reddened, broke, festered. She started to dream of her hands detached from her body, crawling across floors on their own, leaving green-stained tracks behind them. She woke with the taste of metal in her mouth, and the certainty that something inside her had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the hollow, people spoke of signs, of curses that came from keeping blood too close, of old warnings ignored because convenience had demanded silence. A woman found symbols scratched into the dirt outside her cabin one morning, spirals folded into themselves over and over until there was no center left. She swore she had not made them. No one suggested otherwise. Children began drawing things they could not explain. Trees with faces, houses with too many doors, a woman with hands larger than her body, nails dripping something dark and alive. When asked where they had seen such things, the children said they had not seen them. They had felt them. The church opened its doors every night that week. Candles burned low and fast. Hymns were sung in voices that shook. The preacher spoke of purification of cutting rot from fruit before it spoiled the whole harvest. No one mentioned the midwife by name, but everyone knew who the word circled. When the child finally died, it happened at dusk. His body gave out with a sound like a sigh of relief. The rash had spread everywhere by then, skin sloughing away in places, leaving raw flesh beneath. The mother screamed until her voice was gone, then kept screaming in silence, mouth open, body folding in on itself as if trying to return to a shape before pain. The midwife stood apart, hands wrapped and useless, knowing with a clarity that terrified her that this death would not be absorbed like the others. This one would not fade into God's will or mountain fate. Something had crossed from private horror into communal threat, and the hollow, once slow to act, began to prepare itself for violence. The truth surfaced the way it always did in places like this, not all at once, but in fragments dragged into the light by fear. It began with records pulled from drawers that had not been opened in years. Marriage certificates brittle with age, birth ledgers kept in careful script by hands long dead, names repeated until they blurred, dates that overlapped in ways they should not have. Mothers listed as aunts, fathers listed twice. One page even named the same woman as both parent and sibling, the ink corrected but never fully erased. The preacher called it sin. The older women called it necessity. Everyone else called it what they had always called it, the way things were done. But the child's death stripped the language of its softness. When the family tree was spoken aloud, when relationships were traced in public instead of whispered behind doors, something in the hollow broke open. The branches did not merely touch, they folded inward, generation after generation, until blood circled back on itself like a closed loop. The midwife stood at the center of it, whether she wanted to or not. She was proof of the pattern made flesh, born of cousins, taught by blood, trusted because she had never been anything else. And now, with 9 infants dead in less than 2 years, she became the shape fear took when it needed a body. People began to remember things they had dismissed, the way her nails never looked quite right, the greenish tint they caught in lamplight, the scratches left behind on newborn skin. A man swore he had once seen something living beneath one of her nails, writhing like mold disturbed in a cellar. No one challenged him. The hollow was done pretending. The night they came for her, They did not shout. They carried torches wrapped in cloth to keep them from flaring too bright. Fire was not yet the goal. Judgment was. They gathered outside her cabin, boots crunching softly on frost, breath visible in the cold air. The midwife stepped onto her porch before they could knock, shotgun resting against her leg, barrel pointed toward the DI. No one spoke for a long time. Then someone said it plainly. She had to go, by morning, leave the hollow and never return. If she stayed, the cabin would burn, not as punishment, they insisted, but as protection, as cleansing. She did not argue. There was nothing left to defend. When she looked at them, she saw her own face reflected back in pieces, cousins, nieces, children she had delivered now grown, and staring at her with a mixture of grief and relief. Removing her would not fix what they were, but it would give the hollow a story it could survive. As they turned away, torches bobbing down the path like retreating stars, the midwife understood something with terrible clarity. They were not exiling her because she was different. They were exiling her because she was too much the same, a mirror held up too close for comfort. Inside her cabin, she began to pack, and with every object she touched, she felt the weight of generations pressing down, waiting to see whether she would carry the truth with her, or leave it buried to fester. Dawn did not soften the hollow. It arrived thin and colorless, light filtering through cloud like water through ash. The midwife left before the sun fully cleared the ridge, walking the path she had worn into memory with a small bag cutting into her shoulder. She did not look back. She already knew what she would see. By mid-morning, smoke rose where her cabin had stood. They burned it anyway, not because she remained, but because absence felt incomplete without destruction. The fire ate dry timber eagerly, flames licking through the roof, collapsing it inward with a sound like a held breath finally released. Jars of herbs shattered in. The heat. Instruments warped and blackened. When the roof fell, people swore they saw something green flare briefly in the flames, then vanish. The church bell rang once as the fire burned, a single dull note meant to mark an ending. Afterward, men went door to door collecting papers, old Bibles with family records scribbled in the margins, letters, photographs, anything that mapped the blood too clearly. A pit was dug behind the church, and the documents were thrown in, doused with kerosene and lit. Names curled into smoke, ink bled and vanished. The hollow tried to erase itself. Animals were slaughtered that week, goats, chickens, a cow that had birthed 2 stillborn calves in a row. Their blood soaked into the ground as if feeding something already waiting there. The preacher called it sacrifice, others called it insurance. No one called it grief, though grief hung over everything like damp wool. Silence followed. Not peace, silence. Babies were not born for months. Women miscarried quietly and did not ask for help. When labor pains began, husbands loaded their wives into trucks and drove toward the county hospital, even if it meant hours on bad roads. The hollow shrank in on itself, afraid of what might surface if it stayed too still. Years passed. The fire-scarred place where the cabin had stood grew over with brush, but nothing tall would root there. Saplings yellowed and died. Children avoided it instinctively, feeling watched without knowing why. Adults did not correct them. In the late 1980s, a graduate student from Tennessee came looking for something else entirely: anomalies in Appalachian birth records, patterns of infant mortality clustered too tightly to be coincidence. What she found instead were gaps, missing pages, burn marks on ledgers, a trail of whispers that all led back to a hollow most maps still refused to name. She found one photograph tucked inside a mislabeled box at the county office. A woman standing on a porch, hands clasped tightly, nails thick and catching the light. The back was marked in faded pencil with a single word: midwife. No date, no name. The student would spend years following that thread, uncovering fragments the hollow had failed to destroy, and with each discovery, the sense grew stronger that something there had not ended. It had only been displaced. The researcher arrived too late to save anyone, which may have been the only reason she was allowed to leave alive. By the time she began asking questions in the late 1980s, the hollow had learned how to answer without answering. Smiles that closed doors, polite confusion, claims of faulty memory, People insisted the infant deaths were exaggerated, miscounted, or the result of hard times back then. But the records she pieced together told a different story, one written not in ink but in absence. She found death certificates marked unknown cause stacked too closely together, birth announcements without corresponding baptisms, hospital intake logs showing a sudden, sharp increase in women from the same valley arriving in labor after 1954, terrified of delivering at home. Patterns did not lie, even when people did. An old woman finally spoke to her in a kitchen that smelled of lard and boiled greens. She did not give her name. She did not offer coffee. She said only that the Hollow had once believed keeping blood close kept it strong. That they had learned otherwise too late. When the researcher asked about the midwife, the woman's hands shook. She was made wrong, the woman said, but so were we. That's the part folks don't like to remember. The researcher tracked the midwife's path out of the mountains to a hospital in Memphis, then to a long-term research ward, whose records were sealed but not forgotten. A sympathetic archivist allowed her to see redacted notes, fungal cultures, genetic analyses, microscopic photographs of nail beds colonized by aggressive growth, thriving in tissue altered by generations of consanguinity. The notes stopped abruptly after a few years. Cause of death, complications related to infection, no burial location listed. In the Hollow, life continued in a thinner, more cautious form. Outsiders married in. Some bloodlines ended entirely, but the land did not forget. Every few years, a rash of miscarriages would ripple through. Animals would be born malformed, and occasionally someone would dream of hands, thick-nailed, careful, hovering just above skin, unsure whether to touch. The researcher published nothing. Some stories, she decided, did not need wider audiences, but she kept the photograph, and sometimes, late at night, she studied the woman's hands and wondered whether guilt could linger in bone long after the body was gone. Because rot does not require intention, only proximity, and in places where blood is recycled too many times, the past does not stay buried. It waits. Years later, when the Hollow appeared in state studies as nothing more than a statistical anomaly, a spike here, a dip there, it was easy for outsiders to dismiss it as history correcting itself. Progress, medicine, roads finally paved. But numbers cannot record the way a place remembers. They cannot show how soil changes after absorbing too much blood, or how houses built over buried truths never quite settle right. The children born in Raven's Hollow after the fire grew up with rules they could not explain. Don't marry too close. Don't stay if something feels wrong. Don't touch what you don't understand. These warnings were passed down without context, stripped of origin but heavy with consequence. Some listened, some didn't. The mountains kept score either way. On quiet nights, when fog pooled low and the air turned damp and metallic, people still claimed to hear crying where no cabins stood anymore. Not loud, not urgent, just enough to wake you with the sense that something unfinished was asking to be remembered. Dogs refused to cross certain patches of ground. Children avoided them without being told why. The researcher, now old herself, would sometimes take out the photograph she had kept all those years. The woman's face was unremarkable. It was the hands that held her attention, hands shaped by lineage, by isolation, by a community that mistook familiarity for safety. She wondered how many other Hollows hid similar stories, quieter, luckier, or simply better at burying their evidence. The midwife had not been a monster. That was the hardest truth to carry. She had been a symptom of closed bloodlines, of traditions preserved past their breaking point, of knolled passed down without the humility to question it. Her hands had delivered life and death with equal inevitability, and in the end, the Hollow chose to believe that removing her removed the problem. But rot does not vanish when you burn the surface. It seeps, it adapts, it waits for the next place where silence feels easier than change.